Inside a negotiating room somewhere in Pakistan, global diplomacy nearly collapsed in real time. Two men, representing two of the most determined powers on the planet, found themselves face to face, completely out of control, on the verge of a physical confrontation. On one side, Abbas Araghchi, Iran's Minister of Foreign Affairs, a seasoned diplomat who has navigated some of the most treacherous negotiations of the modern era. On the other, Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's special envoy, a hard-nosed dealmaker who has previously forced agreements where everyone else had failed. According to Turkish journalist Çetin, whose reporting was picked up by I-24 News, the two men nearly came to blows. A raw, visceral, almost unthinkable incident triggered by a single subject, a single breaking point, a single strip of geography worth more than all the bombs in the world. The Strait of Hormuz. What was supposed to be a historic diplomatic breakthrough, a first step toward de-escalation between Washington and Tehran, may have just collapsed in the space of a few hours. And what you may not yet fully understand is that this failure, if failure it truly is, will not stay confined to the world's chancelleries. It could hit your energy bills, rattle global financial markets, and destabilize a region that does not need another spark. Welcome to the epicenter of the most explosive geopolitical crisis of this moment. Stay with us. What you're about to hear will change the way you read the world. To understand why two experienced diplomats nearly lost their composure in a quiet negotiating room, you first need to grasp the full strategic, economic, and symbolic weight of the strait at the center of this crisis. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow stretch of water barely 40 kilometers wide at its most constricted point. It is flanked to the north by Iran's coastline and to the south by Oman and the United Arab Emirates. Its physical size is almost laughably small on a global map, but its importance is wildly, almost absurdly, disproportionate to its dimensions. Every single day, between 15 and 20 million barrels of crude oil pass through this maritime corridor. That represents roughly 1/5 of the world's entire oil consumption. On top of that, enormous quantities of liquefied natural gas, much of it from Qatar, the world's largest LNG exporter, flow through these same waters, along with thousands of commercial vessels carrying goods of every description. Put simply, if Hormuz closes, the world runs out of energy, oil prices spike, economies shudder, governments panic. This is precisely why the strait has sat at the heart of American strategic doctrine in the region for decades. The United States has maintained its Fifth Fleet in Bahrain specifically to guarantee freedom of navigation through the Persian Gulf. It is also why Iran has always viewed Hormuz as its ultimate deterrent, the card it can play if it ever feels truly cornered. The implicit threat has always been there. Push us too far, and we shut the tap. But today, something unprecedented is happening. For the first time, that card is not being brandished on a battlefield or thundered from a podium in Tehran. It is being placed on a negotiating table, directly in front of the Americans themselves. And it is precisely this shift, from implicit threat to formal diplomatic demand, that detonated the talks in Pakistan. To place these events in their immediate context, we need to go back just 1 week. After a period of extreme tension, skirmishes, military operations, and mutual threats that had brought the region to the brink of open conflict, both sides announced a 2-week ceasefire. A signal of de-escalation, a moment to breathe. The truce was greeted by the world's capitals with cautious, measured relief. Cautious because nobody was under any illusion about how fragile this structure was. The 2-week ceasefire was not a peace agreement. It was a parenthesis, time, or so everyone hoped, to build something more durable in Pakistan. That construction has now failed, and the collapse of these negotiations puts the ceasefire itself in serious jeopardy. Without the diplomatic framework that gave it meaning and momentum, the truce loses its backbone. The factions, the proxies, the armed actors across the region who had agreed to pause their operations could decide, or receive orders, to resume. The window of de-escalation is closing fast. The negotiations were built around several deeply interconnected dossiers: Iran's nuclear program, economic sanctions, regional security, and at the very center of everything, the question of freedom of navigation through the Persian Gulf. Complex subjects, sharply diverging interests, but a negotiating logic that seemed, at least on paper, to leave room for possibility. Everything accelerated, and everything fell apart around the question of Hormuz. According to the Financial Times, which cross-referenced multiple independent sources close to both delegations, Iranian negotiators flatly rejected the American proposal for joint management of the strait. Washington had put forward a co-administration formula, a mechanism that would have allowed the United States to maintain an operational presence in this vital corridor, while formally acknowledging certain Iranian prerogatives. For the Americans, this proposal was already a significant concession. For the Iranians, it was unacceptable at the level of principle itself. The Iranian counterproposal, reported by I-24 News and confirmed by several additional sources, went far beyond anything Washington had anticipated. Tehran placed two core demands on the table. First, formal recognition of its right to collect transit fees from vessels crossing the strait. Second, exclusive security control over these waters, with no American presence whatsoever and no form of shared oversight. This was no longer a negotiating position. It was a red line. And it was at precisely this moment that the situation came apart. According to Turkish journalist Çetin's account, a violent incident erupted between Araghchi and Witkoff. The two men exchanged words of extreme intensity, the physical tension between them reaching a breaking point. Witnesses present in, or immediately adjacent to the room, described an electrified atmosphere, a disagreement that had ceased to be diplomatic and had become something almost instinctive, visceral, primal. The meeting ended without agreement, without a joint communiqué, without even the polite diplomatic formula about the possibility of resuming dialogue. In the hours that followed, official statements from both sides reflected the full depth of the chasm between them. Iranian state television immediately went on the offensive. It was American ambitions, American unacceptable demands that had torpedoed the negotiations. The domestic message was unmistakable. Iran did not yield. Iran held firm. Iran stood up to the pressure of the superpower. The American vice president, by contrast, chose austerity. Iran chose not to accept American conditions. We are returning to Washington without an agreement. No drama, no direct accusation, but an unambiguous acknowledgement of failure. And Iran's Ministry of Foreign Affairs delivered a final statement that reached far beyond the confines of these talks. We will not forget America's betrayals. We will not forget the crimes committed alongside the Zionist entity. We will not forgive. Language that is no longer addressed to a negotiating table. Language that is addressed to history itself. Behind the almost cinematic spectacle of two diplomats on the verge of a fistfight, there is a cold, calculated geopolitical logic that deserves to be decoded carefully and honestly. Let's take each side in turn. The Iranian position, a revolutionary demand, not a miscalculation. It would be a serious analytical mistake to read Iran's position as excessive rigidity or diplomatic clumsiness. Tehran knows exactly what it is doing. The demand for transit fees on Hormuz is, under international law, completely inadmissible. The strait is governed by the international law of the sea as a transit passage corridor, and no bordering state can legally impose fees on foreign commercial vessels transiting through it. Iran knows this. So why make the demand? For two complementary reasons. First, to anchor a sovereignty claim symbolically. By formally demanding exclusive control over Hormuz, even knowing the demand will be rejected, Iran inscribes in the international diplomatic record the assertion that these waters belong to it, at least morally. This is a long-term diplomatic investment, not a short-term negotiating tactic. Second, because a diplomat close to the dossier, cited by an Iranian source, summarized Tehran's perception of these talks in a single sentence of devastating clarity, it seems Washington hopes to obtain through negotiation what it failed to obtain through war. This reading reveals everything. Iran does not see these talks as an opportunity for mutual compromise. It sees them as an American attempt to recover diplomatically the strategic positions that the United States could not impose by force. And faced with that attempt, Tehran's answer is no. A diplomat cited by MS Now added that Tehran genuinely believes it holds the upper hand in this negotiation. This perception may be the single most important data point in the entire sequence. A party that believes itself to be in a position of strength does not make concessions. It waits for the other side to come to it. The American position: a red line no administration can cross. On the American side, the question of Hormuz is non-negotiable, but not merely for reasons of prestige or diplomatic ego. It is a fundamental strategic reality. Since the tanker wars of the 1980s, the United States has positioned its naval presence in the Gulf as a guarantee of global energy stability. This guarantee benefits not only America's traditional allies, Europe, Japan, South Korea, but also, paradoxically, countries that are not particularly close to Washington, including China and India, whose economies depend heavily on Gulf oil. To cede control of Hormuz to Iran, or even to accept a power-sharing arrangement that would meaningfully reduce America's capacity to intervene in this corridor, would be to dismantle 30 years of American strategic doctrine in the region. It is politically impossible for any administration of any political stripe, and it is militarily unacceptable to the Pentagon. This is why CNN, citing a source close to the negotiations, described the American demands as unacceptable from the Iranian perspective, while the Iranians used the same word to describe the American counterdemands. When both sides reach for the same adjective, it is the clearest possible sign that a negotiation has stopped being a conversation. The weight of history as a structural poison. There is a third factor, less visible but equally determinative: the crushing weight of history in the Iranian-American relationship. Iran's Ministry of Foreign Affairs communiqué is not a rhetorical flourish. In invoking betrayals and crimes, Tehran is referencing a long and specific list of grievances. The CIA orchestrated coup against Prime Minister Mossadegh in 1953, American support for Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War, the economic sanctions that strangled the Iranian population for years, and above all, the American withdrawal from the 2015 nuclear deal under the Trump administration, which Tehran regards as the most recent and most painful diplomatic betrayal in its modern history. This memory is a structural poison. It makes genuine mutual trust almost impossible to build, and it conditions every move the Iranian side makes at any negotiating table. Even when Tehran wants a deal, it must ensure the deal does not look like a surrender, because the last time it trusted the Americans, it was abandoned. Any framework for agreement between these two powers must therefore contain not just political compromises, but credible, verifiable, and ironclad guarantees. And right now, neither side seems willing or able to offer those. Washington is going home empty-handed. Tehran is holding its ground, convinced it has the advantage. The ceasefire is trembling. And somewhere in Pakistan, two men nearly came to blows over 40 kilometers of salt water that happen to be worth more than almost any other geography on Earth. So what happens now? Three scenarios are taking shape, with very different probabilities and very different consequences. Scenario 1. The return of hostilities. This is the most immediately dangerous scenario. Without an agreement to sustain the truce, without diplomatic momentum to maintain ceasefire discipline, the armed actors of the region, pro-Iranian factions, Tehran-aligned militias, could resume their operations. Commercial vessels in the Gulf would be the first targets. Oil prices would spike immediately. And once the escalation logic is triggered, it is extraordinarily difficult to stop. This scenario is not inevitable, but it becomes increasingly probable with every hour that passes without a new diplomatic framework to replace the one that just collapsed. Scenario 2. The tactical pause. Both parties, having measured the full depth of the gap between them, might choose to freeze negotiations without formally breaking them. This is the classic posture of diplomacy in deadlock. You do not say the door is closed, you say you need time to reflect. It preserves a future exit from the crisis while allowing each camp to signal its firmness to its domestic audience. This scenario is probably the most realistic in the short term, but it resolves nothing. It simply postpones the confrontation. And postponed confrontations have a way of returning harder than before. Scenario 3. The intervention of a third party. Pakistan, as host of the negotiations, has a direct interest in preventing this crisis from spiraling in its region. Qatar, which has played a decisive mediation role in previous crises and maintains working diplomatic relationships with both Washington and Tehran, is a natural candidate. Oman, which shares the Hormuz coastline with Iran and has historically maintained its own quiet channels with both sides, is another. A mediation of this kind could produce an alternative formula on the Hormuz question, not co-administration, not exclusive Iranian control, but perhaps some form of multilateral oversight mechanism involving neutral regional actors, allowing both parties to claim a form of victory without conceding their core positions. This is the least probable scenario in the immediate term, but it is not impossible, and it may ultimately be the only path that allows this crisis to be resolved without a return to open conflict. What happened in Pakistan over these last hours is not simply another diplomatic crisis in a region that has seen too many. It is the reflection of a structural confrontation between two fundamentally incompatible visions of global order. One held by an America that insists on guaranteeing the freedom of the seas, another held by an Iran that insists on asserting its sovereignty over the waters that border it. These two visions will not be reconciled easily, not in a few days of high-pressure negotiations. Not with special envoys working against the clock. Not until both parties have made the cold calculation that the cost of failure exceeds the cost of compromise. The next time you hear the word Hormuz, and you will hear it again soon, you will know what that name truly represents. Not just a strait, not just oil, but the precise point where geography, history, and the ambitions of nations collide in all their brutality. And somewhere inside that story, two men nearly threw punches. Not for an ideal, not for a conviction, but for 40 kilometers of salt water that are, in reality, worth everything.